AngularJS is an MV whatever framework. I say choose whatever pattern helps you be more productive. So I've seen people say, oh, it's MVC or it's NV whatever. Is choose a pattern that makes the most sense to you and that helps you wrap your mind around it and start writing code. With that said, here's my 2 cents. The 2-cent slide is I personally prefer to see it as a model view model. Pattern, I think it's probably the closest that you're going to get is where you have your view, which is bound to your view model. So your view model would be scope in conjunction with controller. A lot of times I'll actually see controller and scope kind of as one single entity. But your view binds to your scope. So your view and your view model is you have the data bindings, as well as the view can call commands on the view model. The beauty of this is you can actually have one view model or one scope and controller for multiple views, because the controller and scope is completely content unaware, or it's actually layout unaware. It doesn't know anything about the view, so it's really easy to swap out views on a controller. That kind of having that line and everything decoupled is really great. From there, when I say model, I'm talking about the domain model. Is the data that your entire application needs to share, and I classify that as services. So you basically have your view, which is your HTML that's been injected with scope, so kind of your live view, your view model, which is scope and controller, and your model, which is essentially your services or your domain model. Now, there are people I know that will argue with me or would say, no, 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 services, it's overloaded. Don't call it that. Don't use domain model. And I would say, you know what? You're probably right, or in a certain context, you're right. I'm not going to fight. It's not worth it. But with that said, does this make sense, kind of how I've organized this here? Any questions? Yes?
So the model in AngularJS, is that mean just whatever you get from services? Do you have anything like backbone model collection kind of concept?
No. So you also have the closest equivalent to that. So the question was, do we have something similar to backbone model or collection? And the answer is no, not really. The closest thing we have is whatever is on scope. So AngularJS, I believe in the documentation, they call it your application model. And so I think of your domain model is something that covers basically your application domain. But then you have kind of these submodules, models rather, which is your application model, which is what your view model controls. The difference between that and backbone is your model in AngularJS at that level is just a JavaScript object. It's like you do not wrap your model in anything. You don't need to, because you have two-way data binding. But where I did scope.hello or scope.world, like that's your model on a kind of this very specific application level. Does that make sense? And then your main model would be, your domain model would be anything that kind of exists within your services.
But I mean, I feel like backbone has a lot of, helpers when you're dealing with the domain model. Like underscore and things like that.
Yeah.
Which means Angular doesn't have that. But in real life, how do you deal with it?
Can you give me an example?
Like if I have a lot of collection, I have a lot of IDs, I want to, iterate through or sorting or things like that. Do you use underscore, or you kind of, in real life, how do you deal with it?
So I would use underscore. I've also used sugar as well. At that point, you're just manipulating the model just as a JavaScript object. But if I had like an array of objects and I needed to pull out a piece, or I needed to sort something, I would use underscore to do that. But then the minute you modify that collection on the scope level, your view knows about it.
Even about sync, like do you wrap that in the services? Like if you need to sync model back, or pull it out, or save one model to the server?
So on a persistent, so that would, like that level, so that's a very good question. The question is, if you need to save something to your server, where does that go? And how do you do that? I would put that in a service, and then I would then call the server from there, and then I would call the server, get the result, and then that would live within the service itself. So for instance, an example would be if I had a list of, let's say, books, a collection of books that I wanted to display, and then I wanted to update a book. How would you do that and get it to the server? I would modify it first on a local level within the view in the view model. But then I would propagate that change to the service, so maybe like a book service, which would then go and do it, would basically say, hey server, I've changed, and it would go ahead and do that. And so there's some strategies around, how do you handle that? Do you basically send that change directly to the server and then rehydrate your entire model? Or do you basically modify it at a local level and then only roll that back if something has went wrong? Because if you do it immediately at a local level, then it's very responsive. So the person that made that change is like, oh, it's already updated. And then if something goes wrong, then you just roll it back. Or I've seen it where you actually do it at the server because maybe there's some transactions, or maybe you don't want to allow that to happen for whatever reason. You would basically go do that server, and then if it failed, then that service would then control that controller and say, hey, this happened, you need to know about it. But maybe, and the reason why I differentiate between the controllers and the services is maybe you have two controllers watching that same data. And that's the point of services, is kind of this, any information that you would need across your entire application or be consumed by multiple controllers. Does that make sense?
Okay, I think.
Okay, so I'll get a little bit more into that, but
Okay, sure.
We need to keep going.
Okay.
But like the view model is not violating the single responsibility principle by it's being a view model as well as a controller. So it's violating the single responsibility principle, right, in that case?
So that is a philosophical discussion for lunch.
Okay.
So the question was, does having a view model in a controller, does it violate the single principle of responsibility? And I think no, I don't believe so.
Okay.
But we'll hash that out over lunch, and then you can blog about it.